This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today, I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 most busted lands in the history of the game. Most of the time, when I look at cards in this series, I use a point system that rewards cards for having top 8s at high-level Magic events. While I do think that sort of video is valuable, I mean, I'd have to, right? I've made like a billion of them at this point. I do think approaching the best cards from a different angle is worthwhile too. After all, cards that get banned across multiple formats are at a natural disadvantage in that type of video. That's something I want to remedy with a top 10 like this one. Instead of basing this list on top 8s at major events, this list is based on my opinion, at least to some degree. To appear on this list of broken cards, a card has to have been banned or restricted in at least one format. Most of them are banned and or restricted in more than one format too. In other words, every card on this list was utterly dominating at least one format at one time or another, to the point that they had to remove it from that format entirely to put an end to their dominance. Obviously enough, if a card isn't or hasn't been banned at any time in its history, it's pretty difficult to consider it one of the most busted lands of all time. Alright, without further ado, here are my picks for the 10 most broken lands in the history of Magic. At number 10, I have Cloudpost, which is banned in both Modern and Pauper. This is a land with the Locust type that enters tapped, and it can be tapped for 1 mana for each Locust in play. If you can get multiple Cloudposts in play, things can get out of control in a hurry. From the beginning, Cloudpost was a powerful card. It was used in Mirrodin block constructed decks that could search it up with Sylvan Scrying and Reap and Sow. However, it wasn't completely broken, and the card didn't make any noise in other formats for the next few years. However, things changed for Cloudpost in 2006 when Vesuva was printed in Time Spiral. It can enter the battlefield as a copy of any other land, so now you could get even more copies of it in play. This led to Cloudpost decks showing up in Extended. Then, in 2010's Scars of Mirrodin, they printed a new Locust, Glimmerpost. It didn't have the same ability to multiply mana all on its own, but it still meant that you had access to another Locust to make your Cloudposts even better, and gaining life when you're a ramp deck is usually pretty helpful too. These two Locusts weren't legal in Extended together though, so it didn't create a huge problem. That is, until Modern was created to replace Extended in 2011. In this new format, both Locusts were legal, so you could now run 4 copies of each alongside Vesuva, and things got silly in Modern in a hurry. A Cloudpost deck top-8'd the very first Modern Pro Tour. It was capable of powering out Emrakul very early in the game, and that was a serious problem, so Cloudpost got banned immediately following the event, and it's never been unbanned in Modern, and it probably never will. After all, Cloudpost decks are still a very real factor in Legacy. At number 9, it's Dark Depths, which was banned in Modern. This legendary land can't produce mana, and it enters a battlefield with 10 ice counters on it. You can pay 3 generic and remove an ice counter, and once it has no ice counters, you get a 20/20 flying indestructible token. Like Cloudpost, Dark Depths didn't do a ton for the first several years of its history. In fact, it was considered one of the worst cards in the game. It was way too slow to ever do anything worthwhile. However, that all changed in a big way, thanks to the printing of Zendikar's Vampire Hexmage, which could sacrifice itself to remove all counters from a permanent. And that meant you could get that 20/20 as early as turn 2, since Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth could make it so that even your Dark Depths could tap for black mana. When Modern was created in 2011, Dark Depths was preemptively banned to keep this incredibly fast combo from being available, and it's a good thing too, because in the years since then, the printing of Thespian Stage has made the combo even more consistent. The stage can copy Dark Depths, but because it's already in play, it doesn't get the counters, so you immediately get the token. As with Cloudpost, this banned Modern card is incredibly important in Legacy, where there's an entire archetype called Lands that features the Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo as one of its main win conditions. At number 8, it's Eye of Iugan, our third consecutive land that is both banned in Modern and took a while to truly become broken. Like Dark Depths, this is a legendary land that doesn't produce mana. It reduces the cost of your Eldrazi spells by 2 generic mana though, and you could pay 7 generic and tap it to tutor up a colorless creature and put it into your hand. Eye of Iugan did a little bit in Standard where, as you'd expect, it was played in an Eldrazi ramp deck, but those decks weren't busted. All the powerful Eldrazi cost a ton of mana, so there wasn't anything too silly that could happen, and the deck only had one premier event top 8. However, that would change about 6 years later in Modern, where Eye of Iugan helped usher in a period known as Eldrazi Winter, a time where utterly broken Eldrazi aggro decks dominated the format. This happened because Battle for Zendikar block introduced several powerful, less mana-intensive Eldrazi, not just big, expensive monsters. Most notable among these were Eldrazi Mimic, Thought-Knot Seer, and Reality Smasher, which could easily be played on turn 1, turn 2, and turn 3 respectively, thanks to Eye of Iugan as well as Eldrazi Temple. After these few months, it was decided that the deck had to be removed from the format, and they banned Eye of Iugan to do just that. As with Dark Depths and Cloudpost, this banned Modern card has gone on to some serious success in other formats, and it's been the most successful of the three on the bottom of this list, as Eldrazi decks have been very successful in both Legacy and Vintage, thanks in large part to Eye of Iugan's insane ability to make your Eldrazi so much cheaper. At number 7, I've got Field of the Dead, which got banned in Standard, and is also banned in Pioneer, Historic, Explorer, and Modern. It's interesting that the bottom 4 on this list all have a colorless identity. Anyway, Field of the Dead enters tapped, can tap for colorless mana, and when it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you get a 2/2 black zombie creature token. A land being a value engine is very powerful. After all, this land can produce mana for you like any other land, and then in the late game it starts cranking out 2/2s for no mana at all. Obviously, it takes some setup, and at first it might seem like needing all of those lands with different names would be enough of a deck-building burden to keep this from being completely broken, but obviously enough, it's on this list and banned in 5 formats, so it didn't really work out that way. In Standard, it was played in ramp decks alongside Golos and Circuitous Route. Golos can even tutor up the field, making it far too easy to get things going. While there was a Scapeshift combo version of the deck, that wasn't the version of the deck that got it banned. Instead, the most busted Standard version of this deck was a Bant Control Shell that could just sort of hang back and do control things while adding 2/2 zombies to the board simply by hitting a land drop every turn. It got banned out of Standard only 3 months after being printed, and a few months later it was banned in Pioneer and Historic, and in 2021 it got banned in Modern. It is simply too good of a win condition for control decks, as it takes no mana, is hard to interact with, and is surprisingly easy to set up. At number 6, I have the Mirrodin cycle of artifact lands, which were banned in Block and Standard and are currently banned in Modern. There's one for every color, and they can tap for mana of that color. At first glance, these might not seem like a big deal, but giving lands artifact typing, without any real downside in terms of the mana they're able to produce, was a really bad idea, especially in a block that featured lots and lots of artifact payoffs. Most notably, there was Affinity, which reduced the cost of a spell for every artifact you control, so if you had cards with Affinity for artifacts, it was like these lands could tap for 2 mana at a time. Furthermore, these lands allowed you to make it so that every single card in your deck was an artifact, so artifact payoffs like Arcbound Ravager, which is inherently strong anyway, became even better, since every permanent in the deck could be sacrificed to it. As a result, Affinity decks utterly dominated Block and Standard, where it got banned, and they were also a major player in Extended. When Modern was created in 2011, all the lands in this cycle were banned, so that Affinity decks wouldn't just crush everybody. It's a good thing they took that step too, since Affinity decks were indeed a huge part of the format even without artifact lands. Alright, it's time to move into the top 5 of this list. If you think we've seen some overpowered lands so far, the top 5 is truly going to blow you away, as all of them are banned in every 60-card format except for Vintage, like my number 5 pick, which is Library of Alexandria, a land that is only legal as a one-of in Vintage. It can tap for colorless mana, and you can also tap it to draw a card, but you can only activate the ability if you have exactly 7 cards in your hand. That might sound like a big enough restriction, but it's kind of like Field of the Dead. It's a land that grants you a ton of value for absolutely no mana investment, so even though you've got to play the game in a certain way to get that value out of it, it just isn't enough to balance the card. Drawing an extra card every turn for 0 mana is nuts. It helped make control decks utterly dominant in the early days of Magic. And the library has been overpowered since day one. It ultimately got restricted in 1994, ahead of the first competitive tournaments, at a time when there was only one format in Magic. Once new formats were created, it was banned in all of them, apart from Vintage, of course, where, as I've mentioned, it was restricted. In other words, since the birth of competitive Magic, the library has never been legal as more than a one-of in any format. And in most of them, it's never been legal at all. The library is an interesting card because it would truly get absurd if you were allowed to play a 4-of, as consistently getting it in your opening hand would be nuts. Restricted to a 1-of, it doesn't actually see that much play in Vintage, because it gets significantly worse when you don't get it in the early game. At number 4, I've got Bazaar of Baghdad. This land can't produce mana, but boy, does it have an insane activated ability. You can tap it to draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. You go down a card when you do that, of course, but it allows you to dig deep into your deck while loading your graveyard. The Bazaar is the only card in this top 5 that wasn't completely busted the day it was printed. Graveyard decks weren't really a thing in Magic until later in the 1990s, and even then the Bazaar was never too good. As a result, it didn't actually get banned anywhere until it got the axe in Legacy in 2004. It has only gotten more powerful with time, as there have been more and more payoffs for loading your graveyard. It can be particularly insane alongside Dredge, a mechanic that lets you replace drawing a card with milling cards from your library. So if you have Dredge cards in your graveyard, when you tap Bazaar, you can mill a massive chunk of your deck. Bazaar is legal as a full 4 of in Vintage, where it's a format-defining card that powers some of the most dominant decks in the format. Many of these decks don't even bother running any mana, because they can just throw their deck in the graveyard and get a bunch of recursive creatures out of it. At number 3, it's Strip Mine, which is banned everywhere but Vintage, where it's restricted. This land can tap for colorless, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a land. In other words, it's basically a free land destruction spell that can also produce mana when you'd rather do that. This is another card where it was clear from day one that it was too good for competitive Magic, and it was restricted ahead of Magic's first competitive event. Over the years, it's gotten even better, as we've received powerful ways to easily recur lands like Life from the Loam and Wrenn and 6. You can see just how powerful this card is because a fixed version of it, Wasteland, which can only go after non-basic lands, is still one of the most heavily played cards in the Eternal formats. At number 2, it's Misras Workshop, which is banned everywhere but Vintage. It can tap for an insane 3 colorless mana. While you can only spend that mana on artifacts, that restriction isn't enough to keep this from being busted. Like many cards on the list, it got restricted before Magic's very first competitive event in 1994. It's gotten even better over the years as more and more insanely powerful artifacts have been printed. Like Bazaar, it is legal as a full 4 of in Vintage, and as a result, there are many decks built around abusing this overpowered land, and they're among the best decks in the format. Since there are only 8 lands in the history of Magic that have been banned and don't appear on this list, I thought I would quickly address those as honorable mentions before we take a look at number 1. First, there's Ancient Tomb, which got banned in Extended. Most of these honorable mentions are in no particular order, except this one, which was the closest to making the list. It has a higher floor than the number 10 card, Cloudpost, since it can always tap for 2 mana, but the ceiling of the card isn't nearly as insane as Cloudpost's, so in the end it didn't quite make the list. Next, there's Mystic Sanctuary, which is banned in both Pauper and Modern. This land gets you an instant or sorcery back from your graveyard and puts it on top of your library. Once again, we're talking about a land that gives you a very real effect for no mana at all, and this proved particularly problematic in Modern, when you could combine it with something like Cryptic Command to just keep getting it back. It also has the island type, which means you can grab it with a fetch land. Next, there's Serra's Sanctum, which is a legendary land that can tap for 1 white for each enchantment you control. This can offer a pretty insane mana boost, and as a result it got banned in Urza's Block Constructed. There's also Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. This land enters tapped, can tap for red mana, and whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, if you control at least 5 others, it can do 3 damage to a creature or player. While it is an inherently powerful land, since it's yet another one that generates real value for no mana at all, it only truly became overpowered when you combined it with Scapeshift or Primeval Titan, which can get you mountains and copies of Valakut incredibly quickly. With Scapeshift and Valakut, you usually win the game on the spot. It was only ever banned in Modern, and only for about a year. There's also Ramunap Ruins, which got banned in Standard. It gave red aggro decks a great way to close out the game even after the opponent stabilized. It got banned to make it a lot harder for those decks to win if they didn't win in the first few turns. The fetch lands are banned in Pioneer. They allow you to tap and sacrifice them and pay 1 life to search up a land with one of 2 land types. These provide great fixing, especially in formats with dual and tri lands, and in the interest of making mana less consistent, these were preemptively banned from Pioneer. This also had the added bonus of weakening Deathrite Shaman, which could exile fetches from the graveyards for mana. There's also Karakas, which is only banned in Commander. It can tap for white, and you can tap it to bounce a legendary creature to its owner's hand. While certainly powerful in 60-card formats, it's busted in Commander for obvious reasons. You can use it to constantly bounce opposing commanders for free, or perhaps even more impressively, you can use it to bounce your own legendary creatures to save them from removal or rebuy into the battlefield abilities. Rishadenport got banned in Mask's Block Constructed because it was far too good at disrupting your opponent's mana. This was particularly powerful for aggro decks, which could get ahead on board while disrupting the opponent. The port has of course continued in that role in Legacy. Lastly, there's Thawing Glaciers, which got banned in Ice Age block constructed. It allowed you to search up basic lands and put them into play while bouncing glaciers to your hand. This might not sound great, but when combined with Zuron Orb, you ended up with a life gain engine that made it impossible for creature decks to do well in block constructed. Alright, with all of those honorable mentions out of the way, let's take a look at the number 1 card, which is Tarian Academy and Gaia's Cradle. These two are part of the same cycle as Serra's Sanctum. Academy is a legitimate number 1, while I would have had the Cradle at number 6 if I gave it its own slot. In the interest of looking at more lands, I thought it was better to put these two together. The Cradle can tap and give you 1 green mana for every creature you control. If you combine it with lots of cheap creatures, it can provide a serious mana boost, and that was enough of a problem that it got banned in Urza's block constructed. It sees heavy play in every format it is legal in, which means Legacy and Vintage, as well as Commander. As powerful as the Cradle is, Academy is several orders of magnitude more overpowered. That's why it's banned everywhere but Vintage, where it's restricted. It can tap to give you 1 blue for each artifact you control. This is more powerful than getting mana for creatures or enchantments, because there are far more free artifacts than there are creatures or enchantments. So, getting multiple mana out of Academy on turn 1 is very easy, and things get sillier from there, especially if you have ways to untap it. Like the other cards in the top 5, it's banned everywhere but Vintage, and it's restricted there. So those are my picks for the most busted lands in the history of Magic. If you want to own any of these ultra-powerful lands, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.